This is part 3 of the film clips about the AQA GCSE history course, the unit The First World War. This looks at the end of the war between 1917 and 1918. The strategy and tactics and the weapons that the Allies had developed since the start of the war in 1914 start to all come together by the time you get towards 1917 and 1918, and it ultimately leads to the great Allied victories in the summer of 1918 that lead to the German surrender in November of 1918. There's a few key events that take place in 1917 and in early 1918 that you need to be really clear on before we then go on to have a look at why Germany surrendered in November 1918. 1917 sees two big changes that take place on the Allied side. So when I mention the Allies, the side I mean is the Triple Entente, that is Britain, France and Russia. By 1917 they're increasingly known as the Allies, and that's because the Americans get involved in the war. In part 2 of the film series that I've made about the First World War, I mentioned about how in 1915 the passenger liner, the Lusitania, was sank by a German submarine, and that led to the loss of 128 Americans. And that doesn't quite provoke the Americans to get involved in the war at that point, but they had made it clear that they weren't happy and that if those attacks continued, they'd become involved in the war. By 1917, the Germans have restarted their unrestricted submarine warfare, their unrestricted U-boat warfare. This was something they paused following the sinking of the Lusitania because they didn't want to bring America into it. However, the effect of Britain's blockade on Germany, which I'll talk more about later on, forces the Germans to act. They feel it's a fight for their survival. People are starving at home. There's a risk that if they can't bring this war to an end soon, then they're going to be on the losing side of it. Therefore, they restart their unrestricted submarine warfare. At the same time, there are also talks going on behind the scenes between Germany and Mexico. Germany is trying to encourage Mexico to invade the United States, to start a war against them and enter the war on the side of Germany. Their hope is that if America is too busy fighting its own war on its own continent, then it won't bother to spare troops, or won't be able to spare troops, to go and fight in Europe. However, these secret talks are discovered, they're uncovered by the Americans, who then, along with the continued attacks on their ships, decide that they have little option but to get involved. President Woodrow Wilson makes a famous speech in the US where he states that they're not just fighting here to protect ships, but that they're also fighting to try and bring peace to the world. They're fighting to bring freedom to the world. They're fighting to bring even democracy to the world. However, although the Americans decide to get involved in April of 1917, they don't have a very big impact. For a start, they've got to assemble their army together, then they've got to transport them over to Europe and actually get them onto the battlefield. That all takes time. By the time they arrive in Europe, most of the main fighting season is over, so they have very little impact in 1917. In the same year, there's a revolution that rocks Russia. The November Revolution of 1917, which by the way is also known as the October Revolution. This is because Russia used a different calendar to the rest of Europe at the time. But this revolution that takes place saw the communists seize power within Russia. This meant that Russia was now looking for a path to leave the war, because the communists, also known as the Bolsheviks, had made it clear that they believed Russia should be out of the war. They believed they should have no part of it whatsoever. From the moment of their revolution, they start negotiations with Germany on exiting the war, and by March 1918 they have agreed a peace treaty with Germany known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which sacrificed quite a lot of Russian territory to Germany. That meant that by the beginning of 1918, you now have millions of German soldiers on the Eastern Front that no longer have to fight there. They're freed up, which enables the Germans to transfer those soldiers from the Eastern Front all the way over to the Western Front. This is their chance to break through the enemy lines and potentially win the war for Germany. The ending of the war between Germany and Russia frees up all those soldiers so that Germany can send them over to the Western Front. By this point, Americans are starting to arrive on the Western Front, but not in very great numbers. Therefore, Germany, under its General Ludendorff, hatch a big plan to try and win the war. This is really Germany's last chance of winning it. They're going to throw everything they've got into an all-out offensive on the Western Front, using these soldiers from the Eastern Front to try and break through the enemy lines and end the war before the Americans arrive in very large numbers. The initial attack goes incredibly well for Ludendorff in what became known as the Spring or Ludendorff Offensive. It led to the biggest change of territory since the start of the war in 1914. It took the Allies, that is Britain, France and the Americans, completely by surprise, and they struggled to halt the German advance. However, if anything, the German troops were too successful and they outstripped much of their supply lines. Also, the blockade, that I'll talk more about in a moment, that Britain had on Germany restricted the amount of food they were able to get to their soldiers at the front lines. So many German troops decided to go and loot houses searching for food rather than press on with the offensive. Because the Germans are slowed down in their offensive, it gives the Allies a chance to regroup and also gives more opportunity for more Americans to arrive there on the Western Front, which they do in thousands and thousands every day. This means that the Spring Offensive grinds to a halt and the Allies then turn the tide against the Germans. This then leads to what becomes known as the 100 Days, as the Allies take advantage of the failure of the Spring Offensive to press the Germans back towards their old lines. Under the leadership of the French General Foch, F-O-C-H, they break through the German lines and they force them into a retreat that the Germans never recover from. Much of their weaponry, including a lot of their artillery is lost, along with lots of their equipment and their food. Then in the summer of 1918, you have immense Allied victories on the Western Front, which ultimately the Germans never recover from. By the end of October 1918, it becomes clear that Germany is going to lose the war. It's more a question of when are they going to lose. The Kaiser, by this point, Wilhelm II, has lost a lot of support, not only of his own ministers and generals, but also of the German people, who had been suffering greatly throughout the war. The Kaiser believes that he can still win this. He just needs to be there at the front line itself. But when he travels to the front line to be with the soldiers, soldiers shout at him, they abuse him, they don't want to hear it, and the generals make it clear to him that the soldiers will no longer follow him anymore. They make it clear to Wilhelm as well that the war is lost. They can keep fighting and they will lose a lot more soldiers, but they now no longer have the ability to win the war. Meanwhile, the Allies have made it clear that they will only negotiate a surrender with Germany if Wilhelm is gone. So if you want to surrender Germany, you need to remove Wilhelm from power, then we can talk. And eventually that is what happens. Wilhelm abdicates the throne and they then negotiate an armistice, which they sign on the 11th of November 1918, and that eventually leads to a peace conference that's set up in Paris and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. So why does Germany ultimately lose? Well, there are three big reasons why Germany loses. These are in no particular order. It's up to you to think about which reasons are more important. Firstly, the arrival of American troops has a very big impact on the Western Front. Unlike all those German troops that are from the Eastern Front that arrive on the Western Front, the Americans are not tired out. You see, all those Germans have been fighting in the East for years. They're worn out, they're tired, they really just want to get home, and instead they're sent to the West to fight. Whereas the Americans have not been fighting. They are fresh, they are very well equipped, they are very well trained. And they start arriving at the rate of about 10,000 soldiers a day by the summer of 1918. That is colossal. And against that, the Germans simply cannot continue the war. The other reason why it fails is because of the gamble they make with the spring offensive. Remember that the spring offensive is an all-out gamble for them. It's their last chance to win the war, and it doesn't work for them. It fails. And they knew that if that failed, they would struggle to come back from it. Once that fails and the Allies turned the tide against them, there was no coming back. There was no way you could have one massive attack again. It was all or nothing, and for the Germans, it worked out as nothing. The other reason, which I've alluded to before, is the blockade of Germany that has taken place since the start of the war. So Britain has used the size of its navy to prevent ships from travelling to German ports and stop supplies getting there. This creates severe shortages, not just of food, but of raw materials as well, the kind of raw materials that you need to make the weapons to fight a war. By 1918, there are people in Germany who are quite literally starving to death. They cannot get food anymore, it's not there. This severe hardship that they suffer leads to increasing protests and even riots against Wilhelm and against his policy of keeping them in the war. It turns them against him. It's a combination of these three reasons: the impact of the Americans, the failure of the spring offensive, and the blockade of Germany that ultimately leads Germany to surrender and lose the war in 1918.